Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening to everyone in our audience, wherever you might happen to be in the world. I am Silliman, president of the Arab Gulf States Institute in Washington, and I'd like to welcome all of you for the second day of AGSIW's 9th annual Petro Diplomacy Conference. We have two excellent sessions for you today. The first will be a presentation of the IEA's oil report for 2023. The second will be a discussion of the future energy mix for the Gulf GCC members. Toril Bosoni is the head of the Oil Markets Division at the International Energy Agency and has been tracking international oil markets for the IEA for more than 2 decades. She is the editor of the IEA's flagship oil market report and medium-term oil market report, and a regular contributor to the World Energy Outlook and World Energy Investments as well, and plays a lead role in IEA's consideration of energy security. Ms. Bosoni earned a Bachelor of Arts in International Economics and Business Administration at the American University of Paris and is with us today from Paris, and has had extensive training experience in econometrics and energy economics. So, Ms. Bosoni, the microphone is yours. Please do let us know what the IEA thinks of world energy markets for the next 5 years.
Thank you, Douglas. Thank you for having me today. So yes, I'm going to share my screen. Let's see here. So we just published our medium-term outlook 2 weeks ago now that takes a view to 2028 for all markets. Last year, in 2022, we had the report ready to go to print in the end of February. And of course, everything changed. When Russia invaded Ukraine, we decided not to publish that report to see where the dices might land. But now we just have a new outlook to 2028. And what we've seen, what our report shows, is that the global energy crisis that we saw, that actually started before the Russian invasion of Ukraine, but kind of hit a high point there, is seeing that the transition away from oil has been accelerated. It's not now just climate ambitions, it's also energy security, high energy prices that are leading the scaling up of energy efficiency measures, electric vehicle sales, that will see oil demand growth slow from our expectations of 2.4 million barrels a day this year to only 400,000 barrels a day in 2028, the last year of our forecast. But so while we say that we see the peak in oil demand on the horizon, continued growth from the petrochemical sector, from aviation, means that oil demand will continue to grow each year in this period. So to put it in context, compared to the net zero roadmap and the ambitions for reaching net zero emissions by 2050, we're clearly not on track with those ambitions. For that to happen, further policy measures, behavioral changes will be required. But what we are seeing in our forecast is that demand from combustible fuels, that excludes biofuels, but also feedstocks in the petrochemical sector and other non-energy uses, do peak in the last year of our forecast. So this is good, at least taking us some part on the way when we're thinking about our broader climate ambitions. And from this chart, you can see also that road transport demand, we expect them to start declining from 2026 as some of those energy efficiency measures and the EV take up a bigger share of the vehicle fleet. So just a few words on the demand for different products. As you can see here, it's LPG, ethane, naphtha that provides the biggest source of growth over the medium term. Those fuels combined provide more than half the total demand growth, or 3.2 million barrels out of the 5.9 total in oil demand. Much of this will be concentrated in China, where many new plants have been built to process feedstocks into petrochemicals. Jet kerosene would be the second biggest source of growth, adding 2 million barrels a day. But as you can see, the majority of the growth will come this year more than 1 million barrels a day in jet kerosene demand in 2023, as Chinese passengers take to the skies again, and as also increased travel in the neighboring countries to China. So steady growth through the forecast period, but we're seeing that demand for road fuels, as discussed, are slowing. Gasoline in particular is expected to slow first as it's the most impacted by electric vehicles and efficiencies. So now, looking at where the growth is coming from, it should be no surprise that Asia accounts for the majority of the increase. Here, non-OECD Asia, we see it growing more than 5 million barrels a day over the period, 5.4 actually out of the 5.9 total. It doesn't mean that there's no growth from other regions as well, but of course you can see here that demand in the OECD countries is expected to decline. We see OECD demand going into decline already from next year. Now the COVID recovery, as we see, has largely run its course in the advanced economies and increasingly so in the emerging world. But the projected GDP outlook remains quite weak for the OECD countries going forward. This is obviously high interest rates, tightening monetary policy, and so forth. And the consensus is for weaker GDP growth going forward in the next 5 years than what we have seen recently. So this is driving sort of our demand by regions. I've left in Middle East here. As you can see, we do expect steady growth in the Middle East. Obviously, a dynamic population, steady GDP increases, and so forth. So we do see growth in these regions. Now, just in terms of countries, you can see on the right-hand graph here that China is really dominating the growth, at least in the early parts of the forecast. In 2023, in our projections, China accounts for 60%, more than 60% of global oil demand growth, obviously coming from a very weak number in 2022 when the economy was, big parts of the economy was closed down due to COVID restrictions. But what we're seeing now, there's a lot of concern about the recovery in China not being as strong as many had expected. It sort of contradicts what we're seeing on the oil demand side. Month after month, the apparent demand numbers for China are record high. April, all-time high demand in China. May, very high, up to more than 2 million barrels a day year on year. So very strong growth early on. Of course, we expect this to taper off through the rest of the year, slower. We do not expect continued increases as such, but just holding it steady leaves us about more than 1 million barrels a day of growth and demand in China for this year. So those pace of growth was slow markedly over the forecast periods as some of the policies in China. China has the highest number of EV sales. They're doing a lot on energy efficiency measures, and the economy is shifting over to a more service-oriented economy rather than manufacturing. So this is why we're seeing demand growth slow over the forecast period. India, on the other hand, more robust growth, less of energy transition policies in the near term. Of course, India became the most populous country in the world, steady population growth expected going forward, as opposed to China, when we're now seeing the population shrink in the forecast period. So India becomes the strongest driver of growth towards the end of the forecast period. And that is something that we see continuing over and into the medium term, in the longer term, apologies. So now just looking at moving over to investment, the energy crisis has also seen an increase in upstream oil and gas investment. Our estimates for 2023 is that global upstream oil and gas investment will increase by 11% to $528 billion US. That is up from 475 in 2022. Both of the years are coming in stronger than was initially signaled by the industry in their guidance. And obviously, the impact of higher spending will be offset to some extent by rising costs. We've seen constrained supply chain constraints, rising costs for material and labor eating into to the investment. But still, we think that if these levels of investments are sustained, it should ensure that the markets are adequately supplied through the medium term based on what our expectations for demand. So now, looking at that capacity building, what the investment dollar would get us, we see that an expansion in upstream capacity, production capacity for oil, slowing over the medium term, and to a large extent driven by the Americas. The United States, other American, Brazil, Guyana, other countries in Latin America are driving the growth, at least in the initial period, but that growth is slowing over the medium term. And while the capacity growth is slowing, we do see it still keeping pace with the demand. And so we see a net increase of about 6 million barrels a day in capacity to 111 million by 2028. So now, the broad deceleration in production capacity building reflects, of course, the global pivot towards cleaner energy and the corresponding the weaker demand outlook. I think we're coming to see some of the clean energy technology investments slowing the growth in demand, and so now with investments adjusting to this picture, but still, it leaves us still with a spare capacity cushion of about 4 million barrels a day over our time frame. This is, of course, concentrated in Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates as it is today, and those Middle Eastern heavyweights are boosting capacity today in order to meet demand in the medium and longer term. So we see that that this should, if we are indeed seeing demand growth slowing as we expect, it should keep markets adequately supplied. Iran and Russia, we've taken out here, both countries obviously under sanctions at the moment. But together, we estimate that they're holding about 1.5 million barrels a day of unused capacity. That could be brought online relatively quickly if those sanctions were eased. So now, just looking at supply rather than capacity, so to meet beyond the very near term, where we look at what the OPEC plus producers have put in place in terms of targets, beyond this period when we have visibility on those agreements, we assume that the OPEC plus countries will meet demand. And we see where that leaves us in terms of spare capacity and what increases from different countries. So to meet the projected demand to 2028, we see an increase in world oil supply of about 5.8 million barrels a day. The United States is the biggest source of growth, adding 2.6. But as you could see from the earlier slides, much of this is coming in the 2023 and 2024, where we're expecting a slowdown in capacity building and supply growth in the United States in the absence of significantly higher prices. But we're also seeing that the United States provides about 45% of the increase, but Middle Eastern countries combined are also increasing output by about 40%, or the accounting for 40% of the gains. Just looking quickly at the United States, a bit more in detail, it's obviously the light tight oil, the shale patch that is driving growth, Permian in particular, but we're also expected to see relatively strong growth from gas liquids. Many people forget, obviously not you sitting in Washington and following this closely, but when we talk elsewhere, many people forget that natural gas liquids production in the United States is higher than most any other country's total oil production. So by itself, it's quite a significant source of supply and supply growth over the medium term period. So for us, natural gas liquids increasing by almost 1 million barrels a day, which is more than most countries add in total. And we also have 1.7 of the growth in crude oil. And the reason why we're seeing the slowdown in its growth is obviously much talked about, focus on climate action and concerns on ESG goals, but also most notably the return of capital discipline, reducing debt, paying investor dividends instead of just delivering growth for growth's sake that seem to be have taken hold in the US shale patch. So as US growth slows, that would allow Middle Eastern producers, again, primarily Saudi Arabia and UAE, to add barrels to meet demand. And as a result, their market share would increase here now in 2023 and 2024 on the assumptions that the targets, OPEC, the production cuts will remain in place. Obviously, the market share have decreased to about 30% or below. But as the growth in US shale and other countries' conventional oil supply slows over the medium term, we see that the share of the Middle Eastern producers would increase. And given the current investment trends and market trends, we see that the Middle East share of world oil production to increase further over the longer term. Now, just before finishing up, a few words on refining. Obviously, 2022 was quite a spectacular year for refining industry with bumper profits, record diesel cracks and gasoline cracks and end user prices. And obviously, a lot of that had to do with the very sudden or strong recovery in oil demand from the pandemic, and the refining industry not able to keep up with the demand increases of certain products at the time, as during the 2020-2022 period, we closed more than 4 million barrels a day of refining capacity. In 2021, it was the first year in the past 3 decades, or the only year as long as our records go back, that we actually shut more refining capacity than was added. There's always refinery capacity that gets shut, and some periods when demand growth is slowing more than others, but we're always building. So 2021, we saw more refining capacity shut than was started, and that contributed to the tightness that we saw in product markets and those record profits. Now, also, we get back into that a little bit more in detail afterwards. Chinese policy and product exports vis-a-vis emission reduction targets also played a role in the market tightness last year, and obviously also the concern about Russian product flows falling away from the market that helps support the prices. But now going forward, we're seeing most of the scheduled or the announced refinery capacity shut closures completed. So for the next 5-6 years, we're seeing more capacity being added than closed. So 6 million barrels a day of new builds coming on, 4.4 in total. That should help keep the product markets relatively well supplied. Now, interestingly, as for demand, it's no surprise that most of the additions on refining capacity is coming east of Suez, not just in Asia, but also in the Middle East. But what we're seeing is that most of the capacity additions are coming from net product exporters. So we can expect to see more product trade in the period going forward. And what we also see, so here on this chart, we can see that China is the biggest source of growth in the medium term, adding 1.8 million barrels a day of capacity. India adding 1.2. But the Middle East also seeing 1.2 million barrels a day of capacity coming online. So the expansions in Middle Eastern refining capacity, along with additions in Nigeria, in Mexico, other oil-producing countries, will reduce the crude oil that is available for trade. So it would have quite some significant impacts on both product and crude trade flows going forward. Now, just a quick slide on how we see that refinery activity will develop now east of Suez, overtaking the Atlantic Basin in terms of volumes of crude oil actually processed. And we're seeing here that China continue to increase, whereas the US and Europe remaining under pressure as we move forward. Now, with as the driver of future oil demand growth, the east of Suez will also drive or shape the global crude balance going forward. Now, the baseload supply for Asian refiners have shifted. It's not only including the Middle East anymore, it is now taking all of the Russian crude oil that previously went into Europe and other countries. All of the Russian crude oil are also now going to Asia going forward. Yet, looking ahead, still more volumes will be needed by China and India and other regional refiners to meet the demand for crude and products. So the Atlantic Basin, who are at least initially driving the supply growth with the United States, Brazil, Guyana, adding volumes to the markets, the surplus that we see in Atlantic Basin crude supply will increase by 4 million barrels a day. This would all head to Asia or east of Suez in our view, as the increase in demand that we see will not be able to meet that with the increases that we're seeing from the Middle East, which also obviously will go to meet their own increased refinery activity. Now, just one or two slides on product trades. I will, of course, make all of these slides available to you. It's a lot of information in one go, but you can look at them in detail afterwards. But so here, this is just a slide on middle distillate markets. Middle distillates was of particular concern last year, as especially for Europe, it was a major diesel importer and had been relying on Russia for a majority of the supply. So now going forward, we're seeing the middle distillate market relatively balanced over the 2022-2028 period. The regions that are in deficit, such as the Atlantic Basin, excluding Russia, East Africa, other Asia, see their import requirement increase by about 1 million barrels a day. Now, this is matched by a similar sized increase in product supply of distillates from those exporting countries that include the Middle East, India, China, and Russia. But the one wild card, as I mentioned in my introduction, is really what China decides to do. Now, China has the greatest share of installed capacity in the world. It overtook the United States in 2022, and it will remain the largest holder of spare capacity over the medium term. And our product balances depend on higher Chinese product exports, especially for diesel, to balance. So as I said, China's internal policies aimed at reducing emissions from the refining sector. If we see a shift back to sort of more emission reduction goals overtaking the economic activity priorities and support of the industry, we could see the product market seconded again over the medium term. So just a last slide on gasoline and naphtha. So now currently we're seeing the gasoline market relatively balanced in the medium term based on current configuration of the refining industry, and with gasoline demand being the product that declines the most or the first and furthest. we're seeing that the surplus emerging for gasoline over the medium term. And this will be the challenge, the main challenge for refiners, how to balance their product supply with the uneven growth in demand for the different products. Now, what we're seeing on the naphtha side is that with an increasing share of demand coming from the petrochemical feedstock side, and especially from naphtha, as China had built up an increasing share of the petrochemical plants based on naphtha feedstocks, we're seeing the deficit increase. So there is some flexibility here for refiners to feed the appropriate molecules from the gasoline pool into the naphtha petrochemical side if the economics allows it. So with that, I will end my presentation, and I'm happy to take any questions.
Toril, thank you very much for that detailed presentation. I will invite members in our audience, if you would like to ask Toril a question, please use your Q&A feature. But I will start because in this entire presentation, what I find most interesting is the IEA's prediction of a significant drop in production and consumption starting next year in 2024. And maybe, Toril, if I can get you to talk, you have little bits and pieces of the explanation for that scattered among different slides. But if you can pull together where the IEA sees sort of demand reductions and why, starting in 2024 and going through 2028, I know you focus a lot on China. Is it end of the expansion after recovery from COVID? Is it climate change policies implemented by governments? Is it change in investment flows or other reasons that will change your mix?
Thank you. No, thank you for that question. So we do see, so this year, we're really seeing extraordinary growth on a global level in oil demand, 2.4 million barrels a day. And that is despite the weakness that we're seeing in advanced economies. The demand readings coming out of Europe, even the United States, the petrochemical sector, very weak this year. We're seeing the effects of I think what we're seeing is the effect of the energy crisis, high energy prices, but also the slowing economic growth, really taking its toll on some countries and some products. So that's what we're seeing now. But the growth is so strong in Asia. China, as I said, was strong. India hit record demand levels for gasoline, for diesel in April and May. We're seeing very strong growth in the Middle East. So, you know, there's quite robust demand now at the moment. Now, based on the GDP forecast, we are expecting a significant slowdown in demand, overall demand growth next year. So we go from 2.4 to less than 1 million barrels a day of growth in 2024. This is when we think that we're really seeing the impact of higher interest rates on slower economic growth, both in the US. I mean, we've been expecting, not we, the world has been expecting the recessions in the United States and Europe is the most anticipated recession. And we're not really seeing that, but I think there's consensus that the pace of growth will be weak, right? And I think what we're also seeing is some of the measures that were put in place by governments on energy savings, conservation, energy efficiency. It's really, we can really sort of start to see it in a number of places. Going forward, it is the electric vehicle sales. We went from 2% of sales to 30% of sales. I mean, it's quite extraordinary what we have seen in just the past 2 years. China is the biggest market, Europe, second biggest if we look at them together, but also in the United States. The Inflation Reduction Act is pushing some of these policies and in place. So it will take some time, perhaps, but I think we are seeing that. So even though we're seeing demand growth slow, to be clear, in our projection, we see oil demand continue to increase, but at a slower pace. So it's a little bit, but we can see towards the end of the forecast period, when you put all of these policy measures, the efficiencies, we see in the aviation, for instance, the 2 years, and it's becoming remarkably clear now. After COVID, during COVID, we have very low number of flights and passenger seats are back up to pre-COVID level, but consumption in aviation is 10% lower. So this is efficiency improvement. We see it now over the efficiency improvements that have been made over the past 2 years. As older planes were parked to newer ones, we travel differently. So we are clearly seeing this. In our report, we see, I think it's about 7 million barrels a day of oil that would be saved, oil demand that be saved due to efficiency and EVs over the period. So, and for investment, the same thing. I mean, we had the after the price collapse in 2014 and again in 2020, investment obviously declined very sharply. It is increasing, not to the levels of 2014, but I think what we're seeing is the industry is doing a lot more with their dollars today than perhaps they did back then. Even with inflation, when we look at the production cost indexes, we're still getting more for every dollar spent today than we did at the very height of the upstream investment boom. So I think the companies are spending smarter. They're focusing on projects that can come to market relatively quickly, standardizing production systems to be able to reduce costs and to bring them on more quickly. So there's quite a lot of big changes that we've seen just over the last 3-4 years. So that's where we see it.
Let me follow up a little bit on investment trends. Stop where you just ended. Last year, for the first time, sort of overall global investment in renewable energy or less carbon intense energy exceeded traditional investments in hydrocarbons, at least at a global scale. Do you see this as a continuing trend, or do you see that there is going to be, because of the concern about shortage of hydrocarbons and the ability to use them in the short term of an energy transition, there's going to be a rush potentially of more investment in traditional hydrocarbons? Or do you see now that it's going to really be with the Inflation Reduction Act, with suggestions in Europe among different parliaments to promote sort of lower carbon energy investment across Europe, as the United States has done? Is the trend going to continue with a larger difference between investments in renewables versus traditional hydrocarbons?
Thank you. No, it's true. We saw a tremendous increase in clean energy investments over the past few years. And we talk a lot about this. The IEA published the World Energy Investment Report back in just a week before we released our oil outlook. And you can see very clearly that the momentum for clean energy investments is really picking up. And as I said, we think that this is also due to the energy crisis, reducing reliance on Russia here in Europe, or for imports for gas or even for oil. So you have the combination of the climate ambition with energy security, and also now for solar, for instance, is cost competitive. It's the cheapest source of electricity. And you're seeing these cost reductions where clean energy technologies are becoming competitive on their own without the government support, right? But what we show in that report, that despite the very significant increase in clean energy investments and it overtaking fossil fuel investment, it's not enough to get us on the net zero trajectory. It has to double or triple again. So more is needed on the energy, on the clean energy investment, and especially in emerging and developing countries. So that's obviously more difficult to find the finance. How do we ensure that the cost of capital is comparable, that we will be able to unlock the potential in the emerging and developing countries, because we're not seeing that right now. The majority of the clean energy investments are taking place in advanced economies in Europe, the United States, North America, and also in China. So we need to see increased investment in other areas. And if you don't have that an even stronger increase in clean energy investments, it means that we do need to continue to invest in oil and gas. This is where we have a lot of discussion. You cannot have one without the other, right? So for now, we're seeing that these investments and changes in behavior and patterns are reducing the growth in demand for oil, but it's not taking demand from oil away. So we do need to continue investing. If it's sufficient, that's sort of this $550 billion US dollars a year level. It depends on what we see on the clean energy side.
You also
we do think that it will continue to lead towards more and more towards clean energy investment, and it will be required.
And that's actually what I was going to ask you. You mentioned the likely impact of the spread of EVs for transportation. One of the key problems that I can see is the extent to which electrification takes place with clean energy as opposed to increasing production of fossil fuel energy. So as you see more efficiency in transportation, as you see more EVs on the road, is there going to be fast enough growth in clean energy to actually supply the electricity needed for the parts of industry that will be electrifying, for electrified transportation and other sectors of the economy that will be electrified? Or will there be a need for an increase in fossil fuels until clean energy generated electricity can catch up?
Thank you. It has been raised. This is something that obviously has been raised as a concern by many. When you see even in Europe that we're restarting coal-fired power plants to produce electricity, and you have EV sales in China and other parts that are running coal-fired power plants, and say, well, how is this better than gasoline? But I guess in the both in Europe and in China, we're seeing very strong investments in power, so clean power. And that's what's driving the clean energy investments, is to build up renewable electricity, being from solar, from wind, or other renewable sources, even hydro. But we're also seeing a renewal of nuclear. So there's a renewed push to maintain or even increase nuclear power generation as a base load and to ensure security of supply. So it's true that now in some parts of the world, China, it's always brought up that China's the biggest EVs and they're burning coal, but China has the biggest investment in clean energy, electricity. So during the transition period, sure, we will see some of this. And I think there's also a concern about the grid, which is also often the forgotten. We need to make sure that we can deal with the variability of the renewable energy, so that we have enough electricity when the sun is not shining or the wind is not blowing, but also that the electrical grid can handle the increased demand for electricity and the interconnections between countries or regions, and from base load to renewable sources. So this is something that is a focus for many of our member countries and association countries today, as clearly the demand for electricity is growing the fastest.
And we actually have a question from an audience member, sort of taking off onto the question of EVs and EV technology. believe that EV technology should be used for mass transit or other transit in emerging markets? Sort of, I guess the Chinese are going with a lot of electric buses, but does this make sense to move into an electrified transportation system for countries that are going from a far more rudimentary transportation system?
Yeah. No, I think building up mass transit networks makes sense in any country, right? If you can have high-speed rails, railways, to reduce, I mean, one of the major challenges today is to decarbonize aviation, or how do we produce enough sustainable aviation fuels? How do we get down the cost of kerosene? So there's certain areas where you can see quite significant impact for a relatively modest investment, right? So I think that this is the buses in China, obviously the biggest oil consumers, or but we also seeing shift to natural gas, we're seeing to electricity, but in any country where you can build up the mass transit network to take cars, personal vehicles off the road. We all know, we see when population growing in a lot of emerging and developing countries, and the infrastructure not being able to keep up, and the congestions, I think it's quite smart to start thinking about that at an early stage. And if you can electrify that is obviously a very good solution, both for congestions and also for climate, to reach our climate targets.
And I was always actually very interested in your comparison of the three largest oil consumers in the United States, China, and India. I wanted you to sort of throw Europe into the mix. And I wanted to know whether Europe is roughly following the trends of the United States, or are there significant divisions in trends within the European Union or Europe more broadly? And sort of how does Europe contribute to this potential slowing demand for oil, or frankly, increase in renewable energy or clean energy?
Yeah. Europe also, we're expecting oil demand to start contracting also in Europe. The European Union has put in place very ambitious targets, even for 2030, and we're seeing some of these measures coming in now. I think that's clear. So I think in terms of comparing Europe to US, already in the US, you might have more potential for easy gains, as the European energy, or the road transport at less, has a higher efficiency already compared to the US car fleet. But of course, the driving patterns are not the same. In Europe, you do have more mass transit use, but I'm seeing that this is also being developed more and more in the US. But it's the same trends. It's gasoline demand that falls the first, both in the United States and in Europe. The penetration of electric vehicles. You will continue seeing growth in middle distillates, where air travel and freight it's still will keep that positive going forward. And I guess in terms of the petrochemical sector, the US has a clear advantage over European petrochemical facilities because of the cheap feedstocks from natural gas, from gas liquids. But how the two, so when we're talking about comparing and contrasting now, the European sector is obviously more under pressure from increased competition, in particular from China, than the United States. But we're seeing that China is also taking market shares from the US at the moment, despite some, when you think on the face of it, the economics suggests that US would have the advantage. All the new capacity that's come online in China is really putting both Europe and the United States under pressure.
Let me ask a little bit about India as one of the rising consumers of oil in the future, with the Indian population now exceeding China, with the economy growing quickly. How do you see the future energy mix in India? What is India's investment in clean energy as opposed to expansion of energy produced by traditional hydrocarbons? And pulling out, what do you see as their longer term trends on energy consumption and or production?
So we're seeing now Indian demand is for oil for all energy sources will continue to increase for the foreseeable futures. I think there's no doubt that India will be the key driver of growth, not just for fossil fuels such as oil and gas, but also for power. What we're seeing now, but we are starting to see investments into clean energy, obviously. They're building out quite a lot of renewable energy, but because of the underlying demand is growing very strongly, the economy is very expansive. They have a young, dynamic population, strong GDP growth. Demand for everything will increase both in the medium and the longer term. So how we balance that, of course, for India now, security of supply is a major concern. India was quite struck by the crisis last year, struggling with increased energy costs. Of course, now India is the largest, or about the largest buyer of Russian oil, having increased from almost nothing to more than 2 million barrels a day of imports, and taking advantage of the discounted feedstocks. I think the priority is on energy security for now, while we're transitioning away from fossil fuels, not just oil, but also coal. And we see this in the programs now with the G20, all the efforts and focus put on energy in India. We saw, obviously, Prime Minister Modi's visit to DC last week, where there are a lot of the discussion points on energy and climate, and also on energy security. So it's a very dynamic and interesting picture. But yeah.
Have a different question from Kate Durian, who you know very well, about hydrogen. In the part of the world that the Gulf States Institute covers, particularly Saudi Arabia, the UAE, and now Oman, there are significant plans to scale up hydrogen production, eventually to create large export capacity for green hydrogen in the plans. What is your thinking about the future of hydrogen as a source of energy, with as yet not a particularly well set international market? And to what extent is hydrogen actually a pragmatic, practical way to deliver energy if you have to use a storage mechanism like ammonia, which is quite dangerous to transport your hydrogen?
No, thank you. No, so hydrogen is obviously very interesting and something that it's increasing in importance. We have done a lot of work with Oman amongst the countries that you work with. And we had the Minister of Energy here at the IEA when we launched the report. And what Oman is doing as an oil and gas producer, and now setting up for the next industrial wave to shifting not producing necessarily hydrogen from its fossil fuels, but from renewable energy, setting aside a lot of land. So as the demand for fossil fuels decline over the longer term, building up a new industry. And it's very, very interesting. So obviously hydrogen play an important role, especially if it's produced with low emissions, as you said, for ammonia, for methanol, for for transport, because I mean this is the advantage of oil, that you can ship it from place to place pretty easily, whereas for electricity it's more complicated, or clean energy is more complicated. So this is something we're working on. We're also looking at other e-fuels that can be used in transport, especially in sectors that are harder to decarbonize. So if we can have renewable kerosene, not just from biofuels, but from e-fuels, from some of these processes, that would be key. I think it's would be one of the key factors on as we transition, but again, it will take some time to get the supply chains and the infrastructure in place to make sure that it can be done safely and at scale, and to be able and at economics that make sense as we move forward.
So it looks like Japan is now leading the creation of a real market for the use of hydrogen to produce energy. Are there other places which are looking to take advantage of the focus among potential producers on cleaner hydrogen options around the world?
I think Japan has obviously been the leader, the driver here. Japan has limited areas, land areas, to be able to build up renewable electricity capacity on their own. They're very densely populated. They don't necessarily have. So for them to be able to import the energy, it needs to be transported because of their specific location. But we're seeing quite a strong interest also in Europe and in US to build this up. And I think, I mean, once we get there, that's the areas now where we see the biggest interest. But it's something that we will see going forward. For now, hydrogen is still expensive. The e-fuels are still expensive. But once the production and the projects ramp up, could see sort of the similar cost reductions that we've seen on solar or other technologies that have been brought on in scale.
Right. And I want to ask, before we end the session, one final question from the audience about whether or not the IEA's sort of 2028 clean energy projections depend upon the success of long duration storage in batteries, as opposed to production of, I guess, immediately used clean energy. To what extent do you take energy storage or batteries into account as you're looking at your future clean energy projections?
So for our time frame to 2028, or sort of we're looking at the business cycle, the current business cycle, and we're looking at existing technologies. We're looking at EV sales as they are today. We do not assume or put in major technological developments or major changes in policy. We're looking at the policies that are in place today, the technologies that are in place today, that are commercial, that are competitive, and so forth. I think for the sort of the technological breakthroughs, and you have to go, it's things that we look at when we look at the other scenarios, and for the longer term, what would be required in terms of climate ambitions, and see what we would need to put in place to actually reach some stated targets or goals. But our projections are on the current technology and normal efficiency gains. So what we see, an average efficiency improvement in the car fleet of 1 or 2%, or in aviation by a few percent. But we're also seeing the trends in terms of SUV sales compared to. So we assume that we stay on the sort of the same trajectories as we have. There's no break in our forecast.
Right. Toril Bosoni from the IEA, thank you very much for presenting us your report, for answering our questions. We appreciate your expertise in this matter. For everybody else in our audience, we're going to take a very quick break, assemble our next panel, and then restart our programming right at the top of the hour in about 4.5 minutes. So please go get an extra cup of coffee or take a short break, but come back at the top of the hour for our next and final panel for this year's Petro Diplomacy Conference. Toril, thank you very much for being with us today.